I can just have your forbearance. But if Republicans can't get this done, do you deserve to control the Congress?
What's your second question? We're going to get this done. You know why? Because the American people are counting on us. We're going to get this done because we told the American people this is what we're going to do if we get this majority. And guess what? We're doing it. All right. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.
All right, there you have it. That is the GOP tax reform plan. They're naming this the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Let's discuss with our panel, CNN chief business correspondent and co-anchor of Early Start, Christine Roman, CNN senior economics analyst and former labor secretary under President Clinton, Robert Reich, and CNN senior economic analyst and former Trump economic advisor, Stephen Moore. So, Christine, first to you, what are the big takeaways?
All right, taxes are about what you think you're going to pay in your taxes. So let me try to give you the takeaways here. Today, there are a whole bunch of different tax brackets. This would simplify that into 12%, 25%, 35%, and 39.6%. So really shrinking it down. And these are the levels we know now of what you would pay. It's keeping a 39.6% tax bracket for couples who make $1 million or individuals who make $500,000. And that's really important because that was going to go away, and it was seen as sort of giving a gift to the rich and more tax relief for companies and the rich than the middle class. So they changed that there. Doubles the standard deduction to $12,000. So for the first $12,000 of income for everybody is tax-free. What it means for your tax return. No change to your 401k. This was something that was wildly negotiated over the past few weeks. The child tax credit goes up to $1,600. The mortgage interest deduction is capped at $500,000 for new mortgages. So that's a really interesting $500,000 loan. That is something interesting, and one of the reasons why you're seeing the home builder stocks fall today. The property tax deduction capped at $10,000. No more writing off your state and local income taxes. That's something that's going to be a really hard sell with Republicans in New York, New Jersey, and some of those high tax states. It repeals the AMT, though, and it keeps the estate tax for 6 years, but then gets rid of it. Again, that's something that predominantly helps higher earners. That's a $5 million. They're going to double it to something like $10 million. So not a lot of small family businesses fall under this. So that could be something that will be middle class advocates will say that that's not fair. Anna?
And when we look at or heard from Ryan and many of the others on that House Ways and Means Committee, $1,182 more per year is what they say the average family will be keeping in their pocket, or maybe getting in some form from a pay cut or pay check rather raise. Do you see any losers in this? Because they're billing this as a win-win for everybody.
They are. Look, the big winners here are companies. The companies are going to have their corporate tax rate cut to 20%, and that is never. I mean, that is the central part of this, really. I mean, they're selling it as middle-class tax reform, but the company tax reform is what they're really selling here, because they think their philosophy is, and you guys can debate this. Their philosophy is if you cut the taxes for companies, that's going to create jobs and add wages for American workers. I think when you look at this for the big high-tax states like New York, New Jersey, California, Illinois, Wisconsin also has some high state and local taxes. I don't know if getting rid of the AMT is going to cancel out what they lose from all those state and local deductions. That's something that I think that GOP Congress people in those states are really going to fight.
Stephen, any surprises?
By the way, Christine, I think, did just a great job of explaining this bill. Well done. And you're right, Christine. The real centerpiece of this, I mean, I worked with Donald Trump 18 months ago when this kind of plan was originally hatched. And it really is about, primarily in terms of its economic impact, trying to bring jobs and businesses and capital back to the United States. Instead of outsourcing jobs, we're going to start insourcing them. And I think this will be a big start of that. One interesting dynamic that has happened over the course of the last few months is, would this be tax reform or would it be a tax cut? What they came out with today is more on the tax cut version. My only complaint, I wish they had taken on some more of these special interest groups. Trump promised to drain the swamp. Why not get rid of more and more of these deductions that are taken by special interest groups? Because most Americans think the system is rigged, for the wealthy and for the people who have powerful lobbyists behind them. So that's my big complaint. I wish more of those loopholes had been gotten rid of. I do like, by the way, capping that mortgage deduction at $500,000. Bob Reich, that affects the millionaires and billionaires. I would think that's something you would like.
Go ahead and respond there,
Well,
Robert.
let me respond. Steve and I actually agree on a couple of things. First of all, I do think that the capping of the mortgage interest deduction is a good idea. I also am disappointed that there are not more loophole closers. I expected, given all of the concerns about draining the swamp and about all of the lobbyists, that there would be just a little bit more, at least for the crowds, for the public, more sense that there were some big loopholes that were being closed. I think the biggest problem here is going to be the state and local, the closing of that deduction. That's not, well, that you could call that a loophole, but actually there are a huge number of people that depend on that in California, New York, mostly Democratic states, but those are but there are a lot of Republican representatives from those states who are going to be very, very upset about that, that they can no longer deduct state and local taxes. This is mostly a big corporate tax cut, and let's not lose sight of that fact. There's no such thing as a free lunch, and the real question underlying all of this is where are you going to get all the money to pay for this? How much of the deficit is going to have to increase? How much the national debt is going to increase? It's already $20 trillion, and I think the Republicans, who for years have been worried about deficits and debts and crowding out public debt, crowding out private investment, are going to have a lot of explaining to do over the next weeks.
And Stephen, how do you pay for this?
Well, again, the hope is that this will help grow the economy faster. And if you got just one statistic we use all the time, if we could get the economy growing at 1 percentage point faster, and by the way, the economy is already growing at 3% now under Trump, if we can keep that high growth rate, you're talking about $2 or $3 trillion of additional revenue to the government from more people working, more businesses located here and not in Ireland and not in China and so on.
But that sounds good, but
so
that
that's
didn't
a big
work
part
previously when it's been tried to give cuts for
well,
more
we did pretty
economic
well
growth.
in the 80s. We doubled the income. But look, this is where I think, Robert Reich and I agree. If you want to get those rates lower, get rid of the loopholes in the tax system and maybe put a cap on it so the really rich don't get a lot of those loopholes. But on the corporate side, by the way, Robert Reich, we do get rid of a lot of the loopholes that corporations. So some corporations actually have to pay a higher tax. Others will pay low, but everybody's going to be at 20%. That's fair to me.
Well,
I'll let you
but
have
Steve,
the
you
last word here, Robert.
you didn't even answer the question. I think it's a very important question about deficit and debts. Growth has not been the answer with regard to tax cuts. We saw in the Bush tax cuts that actually growth did not reduce the deficits. In fact, we ended up with huge deficits. We ended up at the end of the Bush administration with actually an economic crisis. So the issue of debt, the issue of how much of this is going to be just pumping up the national debt and the national and the yearly deficits is a big, big issue that does have to be addressed.
And then
No,
we
that's
got to
true,
leave it
but
there,
look-
guys. We'll have
Okay.
plenty of time to debate this in the weeks ahead. We know the Thanksgiving deadline is the next one that they have their sights set on. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you.
And thank you all at home.
Tonight, sources telling CNN President Trump has been spending hours isolated in the White House, fuming about the indictments of 2 former campaign aides and the guilty plea from a third as he prepares for his trip to Asia. But what's at the root of the Russia investigation? And is this a case of follow the money? Here discussing national security analyst Michael Weiss, legal analyst Michael Zeldin, Robert Mueller's former special assistant at the Justice Department, and national security analyst Juliette Kayyem. So good to have all of you on. This is going to be a fascinating conversation, I know. So let's just step back, Michael Zeldin, and look at what we have learned so far this week with this Russia investigation. There have been 2 common threads with Trump and Russia, a pattern of friendliness and openness toward the Russians, even after they tried to influence our election, and a pattern of hiding or even lying about campaign contacts with Russia. Why could that be? Explain that.
It's not easy to explain. It seems to me that if you go back in time, Trump's interest in Russia is financial. He wants to build the Trump Tower in Moscow. In order to do that, he's got to curry favor with the Putin regime and the oligarchs. And I think that's driving his behavior early on. He's running for president, and I don't know that he thinks he's going to win the presidency, and I think he still wants to entertain the opportunity of making money in Russia. And I think that informs his behavior. And I think that's what we see as the thread here. I don't think it was a foreign policy driven effort. I think it was a financially motivated effort. Why he's still doing that now is unclear. He still has business going on. His sons are running his business. He hasn't recused himself essentially from that business. There are all these emoluments and ethics issues that are arising.
But could it be something as simple as they're just embarrassed about being grifters, or just that they were just sort of going there to get as much money as they can out of Russia? Could it be that simple and not collusion?
Well, it could be. It could be. I think that as the campaign moved forward, and they thought that they could possibly win, they were looking for that decisive thing, what we used to call the October surprise.
Right.
And I think their October surprise was Hillary's emails. And so I think they really ramped up their efforts to get this information, whether it be through Papadopoulos or Don Jr. in June.
Okay.
They were driving toward that information.
So let's talk about that then. Let's talk about all these, some sort of connection to Russia and all the people. He mentioned two of them. Jared Kushner failed to report multiple Russian contacts on security clearances forms. Donald Trump Jr., met with Russians at Trump Tower and gave shifting accounts. Jeff Sessions failed to disclose Russian meetings during confirmation hearings, recused from Russian investigation. General Michael Flynn, fired for misleading the vice president about Russian contacts. George Papadopoulos, who is new on the radar, pled guilty to lying to the FBI about Russian contact during the campaign. What's at the root of this, you think?
Contact with the Russians for whatever purposes, whether it's some kind of shady financial transaction, or it was more likely an attempt by the Russian government using operatives, and not just operatives, but low-level cutouts and emissaries of the government, right? It's about plausible deniability. You don't send a guy in who says, hello, I'm an officer of the SVR. You send in a businessman or an academic or a think tanker to do the work of recruiting. Cultivating a relationship with the Trump campaign, because look, Trump has auditioned to be Vladimir Putin's best friend. You'd have to be an idiot if you're in Moscow Center not to realize that there was an opportunity here, right? And what Papadopoulos' indictment and guilty plea demonstrates is, yeah, it was entertained at seriously high levels of the campaign, not just to have a meeting between Trump and Putin, which is actually, to me, not even an issue. I mean, that, candidates meet with foreign heads of state all the time. To me, the real disclosure in that guilty plea and that federal complaint, particularly if you read these FBI special agents affidavit that's attached to it, is Papadopoulos was told, again through one of these sort of weird, obscure cutout types, that the Russians had compromising information on Hillary Clinton. They had, quote, we have emails of Hillary Clinton, we have thousands of emails. If you're Donald Trump and you're in possession of this information, which he can only have been, this was, I believe, in April of 2006, about a month and a half before the Washington Post broke the story that Russian hackers had compromised the servers of the DNC. You then spend the rest of the campaign, indeed much of your transition, much of your administration, sowing skepticism and doubt about Russian interference in the election, particularly with respect to penetrating the emails of your opponent. That, to me, is the smoking gun here. Trump knew something about Russian interference in this election a month and a half before you and I did.
Interesting. Juliet, in addition to the contacts with Russians, and this is more Paul Manafort, Rick Gates, now indicted for pro-Russia Ukrainian business dealings and failing to report income. If the feds are following that money, does it lead to Russia through the Ukraine, or does it stop there?
Well, we obviously don't know the full theory of the case, but I sometimes think that we have a tendency to sort of bifurcate sort of theories of what happened. We put sort of Manafort in the follow the money trail, and the Flynn and Sessions and Jared in the potential collusion. And it may be quite possible, and if you look at the timing of both the indictments as well as the plea statement on Monday, it's quite possible that there's actually a single theory of the case, that Manafort somehow ends up as the campaign manager. He comes out of nowhere. He's not really affiliated with Trump. He is beholden, if not an agent of Russia. And that he does so and begins to start a sort of collusion. I mean, we don't know this yet, but I think it's somewhat, I think that the two theories that we tend to talk about may very well be aligned, and we just don't know what Mueller has yet. What we do know, though, and this is why Monday must have been so scary for a lot of people in the White House, is that at least one is talking. No one knows where Flynn is these days, where the former National Security Advisor Flynn is these days. There may be 10 other Papadopouloses who you and I have never heard of before, rarely had heard of before, who are speaking. And that was the point of what Mueller did, which is you're either with me or you could be going to jail. And that's your option. And now it's the people in the White House who may know more to be able to put that theory together to speak. So that's where I think we are. The last thing I'll say is Mueller is much better at this than any of us, right? Yeah. We were all sort of very surprised on Monday by that plea agreement.
The two Michaels I know want to jump on this, but we're going to have more on Paul Manafort's 3 different passports and multiple accounts under fake names right after we come back. Paul Manafort remains under house arrest tonight on $10 million bond, but we're getting new information about his activities. So back now with my panel. So listen, Michael Zeldin, Juliet was talking about this earlier about Manafort coming onto the campaign. He joined the Trump campaign as a volunteer, soon became the campaign manager, chief strategist. What do you believe his intentions were joining the campaign in the first place?
Make himself a player. I think that if he
You don't think that the Trump people knew that maybe he had some influence with Russia, possibly? Or?
Personally, I think that Manafort was brought on because they thought there was going to be a contest on the floor of the Republican convention, and that he had done that for Gerald Ford,
delegates, right,
and that he was going to be able to manage that. I think Manafort wanted to do it because if he's the campaign manager who gets Donald Trump elected and then he goes back to being a consultant, he's the biggest and the best thing out there, and he makes another fortune. So I think Manafort had a personal interest in this, not that Trump had an interest in Manafort because of Russia connections. That's what I think. I think Manafort, but more importantly, Carter may well be the center of the universe when it comes to connections.
Carter Page?
The co-defendant with
Rick
Manafort.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think he is the key for Mueller as a matter of gaining evidence. Manafort's
Rick Gates.
Gates. Did I say Carter?
Yeah.
Gates.
Yeah.
Because Manafort is a pretty damaged witness. 3 passports, 10 passport applications, traveling under false names and the like. He's got to be really rehabilitated to be a witness.
Yeah.
The other guy, he's the key. Because he stayed on after Manafort left. Remember, Manafort leaves the campaign.
But he stayed on.
But he stays on through the transition and is lobbying. And you see the results of his lobbying. They changed the Ukraine platform at the convention. That's the result of their lobbying.
Go ahead, Michael.
American novelist James Baldwin told an anecdote once about police investigating a murder in the Deep South, I think in the 40s, looking for a body that allegedly had been dumped in the swamp. So they dredged the swamp. They didn't find that body, but they ended up finding bodies that they hadn't been looking for murders that had occurred previous to that. I read this complaint of Papadopoulos, and it reads to me like a kind of Mad Libs for compromised blowhards and scumbags, right? You have people unnamed in here who know what they've done because they are being named, and because this defendant, Papadopoulos, has pled guilty to all the charges. So all of these claims are certified as true, according to this guy who's now flipped and is working with them. Papadopoulos, it's been reported, might have been responsible for that 5 a.m. FBI raid in Manafort's house, which means that he knows a little bit more than a 29-year-old nobody intern would know about the inner workings of the campaign, right? Yeah. Mueller is looking to find out things that he doesn't already know the answers to with these indictments.
Juliet, I've got 10 seconds left. Sorry to give you a short trip. Does any of this amount to obstruction of justice?
I think there's already proof of obstruction of justice from President Trump's tweets. I'm with Jeffrey Toobin on this. I mean, when you say you're firing Comey because of an investigation, that's obstruction. Whether Mueller can prove it is another question. But there's no doubt in my mind that the obstruction charges are part of a larger underlying crime of which I don't think we have a clear picture of yet. And it's unfolding before our eyes as more people speak up against what happened during the campaign.
Thank you all. I appreciate it. That's it for us tonight. Thanks for watching. I'll see you right back here tomorrow. The Russia cloud hanging over the White House getting darker and more threatening with the indictments of 2 former campaign aides and the guilty plea from a third. And now there are rumblings from some Republicans who say President Trump should issue pardons for anyone involved with the Russians. My next guest says the president could do that, but he shouldn't. Joining me now is John Yoo, who was a U.S. Deputy Assistant Attorney General during the George W. Bush administration. Good to have you on, Mr. Yoo. Thank you so much. I want to get to all of that, but first I want to ask you about this. I want to get your take on the president bashing our justice system, saying that we have to get tougher and we're afraid of doing anything politically incorrect. You drafted the memo which authorized enhanced interrogation techniques like waterboarding when you worked in the Bush administration. Do you agree with the president calling our justice system a laughingstock?
No, I don't. And I think the thing to keep in mind is that civilian courts are good for some things and military courts are good for other things. The most important reason to have military commissions is when there's classified information at stake. So far, from everything I've seen about the Saipov case and this Manhattan bombing, it doesn't look like there's any classified information or intelligence sources and methods that would have to be kept secret in order to prosecute him. So it seems to me that a civilian court could do a fine job here.
Were you surprised to hear the president say he considers sending this man to Guantanamo Bay? Do you think he understands the implications of that?
Well, I think it would be a mistake. I think, at least in the time I was in the Bush administration, we were pretty careful to make sure all citizens and permanent resident aliens who are caught for terrorism within the United States, within our borders, were handled by the civilian justice system. Placing them in Guantanamo is really an issue for the answer for the most dangerous terrorist leaders who are captured abroad, and it's because we don't have really anywhere else secure to keep them. I don't think that's the case with this Saipov guy.
So should we keep Guantanamo open?
I think we have to, because we do have the core of the original al-Qaeda leadership. And just, if you remember, just the security costs to try them in Manhattan and New York City would be millions of dollars a year. Plus, Guantanamo Bay is a safe and secure facility which we can prevent al-Qaeda attacks trying to demonstrate or even try to free people like that. But I don't think that's what's the issue with the Saipov case. As far as we can tell from the reports we've gotten in the first day after attack, he seems like a relatively low-level, lone wolf person inspired by ISIS or al-Qaeda propaganda, but he doesn't seem to be part of any kind of greater covert network.
Yeah. Mr. Yoon, I want to turn now to the Russia investigation and Mueller. You argue that even if people don't like it, presidential pardons for anyone who falls under Mueller's charges are legal. Saying this, you say, even if Mr. Trump has the constitutional power to pardon Mr. Manafort and his allies, conservatives should vigorously oppose such pardons on the ground that they would do serious damage to the presidency. In the popular mind, pardons imply the commission of a crime. Indeed, a pardon here would grasp defeat from the jaws of victory because the charges against Mr. Manafort show no connection at all between Russia and the 2016 campaign. Why do you think Trump using his power to pardon would be such a bad move?
Don, first I got to say, it sounds much better when you read it than when I wrote it. Look, sounded great. But seriously for a second, I think the president has an almost unreviewable power to pardon. The Constitution only contains 2 exceptions to pardon for cases of impeachment and state crimes. Those aren't subject to the pardon power. Other than that, the Constitution contains no limits. But just because President Trump can do it constitutionally doesn't mean it's a good idea. Here, I think it would be a disaster, actually, for our political system and the presidency for President Trump to take the advice of some and issue blanket pardons because they don't like the way that Mr. Mueller is carrying out the special investigation. If people have gripes with the decisions Mr. Mueller is making, the answer is not to set everybody free or to preemptively forgive everyone who's committed a crime, like allegedly Mr. Manafort and his associates, who seem to be guilty of really money laundering and tax evasion. The answer is to remove Mr. Mueller. If President Trump really thinks Mueller has gone beyond his mandate or is acting unethically or is biased, the answer is to fire Mueller. But the answer is not to start issuing pardons to everyone connected to any alleged conspiracy.
But how would you know? How would you know at this point then? Because it's early on. How would you even know? And I mean, you're saying it has to do with crimes that deal with money and so on. But he's not finished with the investigation yet.
Yeah, that's exactly my point. I quite agree with you, Don. The pardon power is really only for 2 cases. One is when the law seems harsh. That doesn't seem to be present here with Mr. Mayor. It doesn't seem like the law here calls for excessive penalties for money laundering and tax evasion. And then the second case the framers had in mind, the one that's even more important in the Federalist Papers, is the idea that you might have a rebellion or a riot, and you need to pardon people in order to restore peace. Like the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction when President Lincoln and President Johnson issued blanket pardons. That's not even close.
But you don't think there would be a riot now, considering how divided the country is, if he actually pardoned all those people, or if he got rid of Mueller?
Oh, no. My point is just that you would only issue a pardon if there had been some kind of disorder, and you need to pardon people to restore order, to end a conspiracy.
Right.
Here, there's nothing like that going on.
John Yoo, thank you.
Thanks, Don.
And when we come back, lawmakers slamming Silicon Valley executives for their slow response to Russia's ad buys on their social media platforms. We're going to dig into the ads that we now know Russia wanted you to see. Back tonight saying the United States will be immediately implementing much tougher extreme vetting procedures. The safety of our citizens comes first. I want to bring in Rula Jabril. She is an adjunct professor at the University of Miami and CNN legal commentator Ken Cuccinelli. Welcome to the program. Thank you. This is an important conversation, and I'm glad we're having it. So, Ken, the president is using the attack to make the case for what he calls extreme vetting, but Saipov was thoroughly vetted when he came here in 2010. Uzbekistan is not on the proposed list of banned countries anyway. So what's he talking about?
Well, I don't think he's talking about specific countries in this instance so much as a much more stringent process. And you've also heard him, not in that tweet, but in other statements, talk about getting rid of this incredibly random visa lottery. I mean, there's no, if we're supposed to have an immigration system that's good for America, there's no benefit to America in this. This was originally sold as increasing diversity among immigrants, but even without this program, we're taking people from all over the world. So if it was needed in 1990 when it was advanced, it doesn't appear to be needed any longer, and it certainly creates, and this is from the Obama State Department's Inspector General, says it creates counterintelligence problems, it creates national security problems, and it is a targeted program for groups like ISIS to utilize.
So listen, the suspect came, Rula, to the U.S. on a diversity visa. This was 2010. New York officials have said today that he was radicalized after coming to the United States, followed the playbook outlined by ISIS propaganda for the attack. Isn't that an argument for better detection potential to recruits, for people who are recruited inside the U.S. rather than people outside of the United States?
Absolutely, and that's why part of the argument against what the president said today, I think basically we still have confusion about radicalization and terrorism. Whether ISIS is not using this visa because their ideas are traveling online. It's even if they don't have the territory and they are losing territories in Syria and Iraq, basically what they want to hold is headlines. So ISIS is a mental state more than a real territorial state. So what they are doing, they're trying to radicalize people who exist already in the West. There are millions of people, and the only way to reach them is through online. So we need to counter-radicalize those people online instead of focusing on making... We have already a vetting system that is extreme. It takes 2 years and others. We have no... basically few foreign fighters that went to Iraq and Syria. We know that 40,000 went to Iraq and Syria. The overwhelming majority of them, they are Europeans. And there's a reason why Europeans and also Uzbek and from the Middle East, most of them, even when they go back in their own countries, the intelligence is focusing on monitoring them. But what they're seeing and what we are seeing in most of the terrorist attacks that take place in Europe, that who carry them are European citizens or visa holders that were not even monitored or not detected. Yeah. So I don't know if this will work. And my concern, I just arrived from Syria, and I saw what ISIS did in areas like Jarablus and Al-Bab. And what I've seen there, especially the liberated areas, they're paying attention to what we are doing. For example, when the president talked about Guantanamo and Gitmo, most of the prisoners that ISIS took and basically beheaded, they were using orange jumpsuits, exactly the same one that they're using. We have 3 generals, Colin Powell, basically Petraeus, and Brennan, who said not only it doesn't work, they asked to close it, but they said it actually gives a recruiting tool, and the enemy is using it against us.
Well, the president said today that he wanted to, maybe he would want to send them there. Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, Don, one of the problems we have when we discuss the broad subject, is that we talk about it as if each proposal is supposed to be a silver bullet. And this is a complicated problem, as your last panel demonstrated, and as the professor also speaks to, I think, very effectively. There are a lot of pieces to this problem. Some of it is doing a better job of confronting ISIS in the marketing arena that they're engaging in, online overwhelmingly. We've got to be careful inside this country in how we do that because, of course, we have constitutional protections that we have to respect as well within the country. And so how we balance that is an ongoing debate. It's certainly one I've been engaged in. I'm not suggesting that getting rid of this visa program solves problems. I am strongly standing behind, as did Hillary Clinton's State Department, the notion that this particular program is part of the problem. And getting rid of problematic approaches to immigration makes sense for America's security. I'm not saying it'll solve every
You understand
problem.
that a Republican administration tried to get rid of this program with a gang of 8 of bipartisan lawmakers with a Republican president, tried to get rid of this program, and then the president wrongly stated today that this was a Chuck Schumer program when he was part of that gang of 8 who wanted
Don,
to get rid of this program.
You haven't heard me say anything partisan in any of my comments here. I'm happy to blame both parties for this. This thing is 25 years old. It's a bad and indefensible idea as part of an overall immigration
The only reason I said that is because
strategy.
you said a Hillary Clinton State
Oh,
Department.
no. Well, my point was simply that there's agreement on both sides of the aisle. That information came out when Republican, now chairman of the Judiciary Committee in the House, Bob Goodlatte, advanced a bill that in part would have gotten rid of this program back in 2011, 6 years ago.
I'm really happy, Governor, that you're talking actually about extreme vetting and I think most Americans and on the right, on the left, agree on this. I think the problematic aspect that is seen outside, and we care about terrorism and about tackling the problem on both sides. And what we are seeing in the last, basically in the last 15 years, we had 85 terrorist attacks. 62 of them were carried by far-right violent extremists, and only 23 by Muslims. I'm fine with tackling all kind of terrorism, all kind of extremism. The double standard here is after Charlottesville, after Las Vegas, after what happened in the Minnesota where somebody placed a bomb inside a mosque, or somebody even slit the throat of 2 guys inside of a train who were trying to defend 2 Muslim women. So we're seeing some kind of double standards. Nobody asked for harsh measurements when these kind of attacks are attacking synagogues, mosques, African American communities, and we are seeing that the president, this administration, is speaking very harshly hours after against any perpetrator, rightly so in this case, that is from a Muslim country or even brown. So I hope you would come out today and condemn all kind of terrorism without any doubt, and actually push
It's offensive
for
that you suggest otherwise.
No, I'm not suggesting, sir.
You just did.
But I'm not. I'm saying I wish you and the party would push for harsh measurements exactly the same way you would push for harsh measurement when the suspect is basically a Muslim.
Yeah, I think one of the things that differentiates what we're talking about today is that it is related to an immigration program over which is obviously a policy of the federal government, and under statutes can be changed and affected by the executive branch, the president. He does have some control. We've seen this year, and of course, Don has reported on, I've talked about a lot on this network, all of the trials and tribulations of the Trump administration as they have tried, whether elegantly or not, to try and expand the security fence, if you will, related to immigration into this country, particularly from
Can we expand it when it comes to mass shooting? Can we expand it also when, for example, when we talked about mass shooting, it seems that the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, my apologies, it's somehow about freedom and about the price of freedom. But when it comes to basically terrorist attacks by foreigners or even by American Muslim, we are willing to suspend the Sixth Amendment and somehow the ability to have a fair trial.
There's a lot more,
it seems like we're cherry-picking part of the Constitution.